and all are putting hands on a deck to ensure that the peace work fatherland motto of the Republic of Cameroon is a reality and a permanent reality in the country. The efforts are also coming from the international community, with the United Nations human rights spokesperson Ravina Shamdasani, who has strongly condemned the gruesome killing of the students in Kumba in the southwest region of the country, and she is calling for thorough investigations to track down the culprits or the perpetrators, and the punishment that should be given to them according to the law should be thoroughly investigated by the government of the country. It is in this report by Immaculate Fogwe.
He was arrested at his home in Phnom Penh by around 30 police officers.
United Nations human rights spokesperson Ravina Shamdasani is worried about the security situation in the two English-speaking regions of Cameroon amidst the coronavirus pandemic. The leading entity of human rights strongly condemns the killing of at least 7 children in a school in Kumba by armed men. Mrs. Ravina Shamdasani also calls on all armed actors to refrain from attacks on educational facilities, which constitutes serious violation of international law. The organ is urging Cameroonian authorities to carry out independent and impartial investigations and equally prosecute all serious violation and abuses, including acts of gender-based violence by state and non-state actors. She went further to stress on the importance of engaging inclusive dialogue in order to resolve the Anglophone crisis. The organ equally expressed concerns over the human rights situation in Myanmar, Cote d'Ivoire and Tanzania. She's calling on the different governments to ensure that the right to political participation can be exercised by all without discrimination of any kind.
Dr. Christopher Fomunyoh, Senior Associate for Africa and Regional Director at the National Democratic Institute for International Relations, says there is need for serious negotiations to tackle the root causes of the ongoing conflict in Cameroon's two English-speaking regions, the northwest and southwest regions of the country. We will talk more in a jiffy. Dr. Christopher Fomunyoh is joining us today in this edition of the news from New York. Doctor, thank you for joining us today.
It's my pleasure to join you. I wish the circumstances were different, but I'm delighted to be on the program.
Thank you. You are a Senior Associate for African Regional Director at the National Democratic Institute for International Relations. Thank you for your time. You said in your message concerning the killing of the students in Kumba and the crisis in the northwest and southwest regions of the country as a whole, that there is need for deep negotiations to end the conflicts. What are you talking about?
First of all, I want to express my deepest condolences to the bereaved families, to the entire population of Kumba, or K-Town as we usually call it fondly, as well as to all of my fellow brothers and sisters, parents in the northwest and southwest regions that have been so impacted by this conflict. It's been 4 years running. And right from day one, and as I've said over the past 4 years, this conflict is not going to be resolved militarily. It's going to take sincere, serious dialogue. In fact, we've gone past the point of dialogue. We now have to talk about negotiations to get to the root causes of this conflict, to bring this kind of pain that all of us feel after Kumba, to bring that kind of pain and suffering to an end.
Dr. Christopher, when you're talking about deep negotiations, what exactly are you referring to?
I am referring to a process by which the root causes of this conflict, of the grievances of Anglophone Cameroonians, or English-speaking Cameroonians who used to be in the descendants of the former territory of British Southern Cameroons, a recognition that these people have got grievances that are legitimate, and a process, a transparent process through which the grievances are identified and then dealt with one after the other to the satisfaction of this entire population, that they're not going to be marginalized as has been the case in the past. We can only do that through genuine negotiations. And I'm also afraid that given the level of pain that people have gone through in the past 4 years, given the level of frustration and anger that people now feel vis-a-vis the central government, that it's going to be important to have third parties involved in being able to keep the conversations channeled in a positive manner so that the outcome could be something that everyone would identify with and that everyone could then contribute to its implementation.
Before we go further to talk more about negotiations, you said earlier that we have gone past the level of dialogue. Do you mean that dialogue can no longer work? Dialogue cannot solve any problem at this point?
Dialogue is always a useful tool because people have to learn to speak to each other and also listen to each other, and not just talk down to the population, but also listen to them. So dialogue is a useful tool. But I'm afraid that because of the 4 years during which we've allowed the killings to happen, that we're going to need negotiations which are a deeper consideration than just speaking to each other. For example, today we're mourning the 7 kids that were killed in Kumba and the dozens others that are still hospitalized with just terrible wounds. You know, we're mourning them, but this is coming after similar incidents have happened in Gabu. Similar killings have happened in Muyuka, in Ekona, across all 13 divisions of the Northwest and Southwest regions. And because of what people have gone through, you're not going to be able to resolve this solely by speaking to them. You have to make sure that the root causes are put on the table and that all the parties that have grievances are brought into the same room for negotiations, and that the outcome would be seen as the people of these 2 regions as having dealt with the grievances that led to the crisis in the first case.
When you're talking about the root causes of the armed conflict, are you equally talking about cessation, the desire by some Cameroonians from the northwest and southwest regions of the country to restore the statehood of the former British Southern Cameroons? Are you also talking about that?
Let me just be very clear about this, that when the lawyers and the teachers raised their petitions in 2016, at the time nobody talked about cessation. But when you push people to the wall and you don't give them avenues for their voices to be heard, you don't give them a sense that they belong, ultimately, people are going to arrive at the conclusion that they don't belong and that they're better off elsewhere. And as I said recently in my testimony before the United States Congress, the Africa Subcommittee, I said very clearly that with each passing day, with each killing and each atrocity that is committed in the Northwest and the Southwest, more people want to opt out of this process because they don't see a future for themselves or for future generations. So it is incumbent on the state to move quickly to provide avenues for these issues to be addressed in all sincerity. If that has to be put on the table, it should be put on the table. And people should be convinced as to why they're better off with other options. Because at this point in time, there is no individual in the 6 million or 6 to 8 million Anglophones that exist in Cameroon. There's not one individual that I know that has not been negatively impacted by this crisis. Even those who live in cities like Yaoundé and Douala, just by the fact that they can't go home to see their relatives and spend time in the village quietly, it means that even they are being impacted. And when you have this population that's impacted in this manner, you have to be willing to subdue yourself to a conversation in which all of their grievances can be put on the table and addressed. Because if we don't address them now, this conflict can linger for years. And with each killing and with each atrocity, the hearts become even more hardened. And it will come to a time when even secession would be seen as a minimal topic of conversation. So we better do it now than to do it later.
Dr. Christopher Fomunyoh, who should negotiate with who? The President of the Republic of Cameroon has been assigning his close collaborators, the Prime Minister, the Minister of Territorial Administration, and all the other government ministers to handle some issues with regards to the socio-political and security tensions in the northwest and southwest regions of the country, but something that he himself should get on to the field. He himself should go to the northwest and talk with the people. Who should negotiate at this point in time? The Prime Minister, the ministers, or the President himself should come down and negotiate with Dr. Sako, negotiate with Ayuk Tabe, negotiate with Mark Barita and all the rest?
Well, let me just say this also very bluntly, that we all know how decisions are made in Cameroon. We all know that there's no minister in Cameroon that makes a decision without instructions from the head of state. If after 4 years, when thousands of people have died, including people in uniform and including innocent civilians, when we have over 70,000 refugees in neighboring countries, some in the Middle East, some in Latin America, in the Caribbean, and even in North America, when we have 800,000 kids who have not gone to school for 4 years, when we have 1.2 million people by United Nations statistics who are at risk of famine, with projections that if nothing is done in the short term, 3 million people can now be exposed to famine in regions that used to be the bread basket of the country. If after all of these things happening in 4 years, the head of state himself hasn't come to the recognition that this is an existential threat to a sizable chunk of his population, then there's definitely something wrong at the corridors of power in Cameroon. This is an existential threat. And I've said that friends of Cameroon, development partners, shouldn't wait for the worst to happen before they come in to put off the fires. This is the time when friends of Cameroon should wake up and help us dig ourselves out of the mess in which we currently find ourselves.
What can the friends of Cameroon do? Who are they? France, United States, Germany, England, or Britain?
Yes, the countries you've cited are countries that consider themselves development partners of Cameroon. But how can you consider yourself a genuine partner when things are falling apart and people are dying and you're not speaking up? I was heartened to see that after the massacre in Kumba, that the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres sent out a message of condolence to the bereaved families. I would hope that at the next setting of the United Nations Security Council, the crisis in Cameroon could also be discussed. Look at how the international partners have rallied around to resolve the issue in Libya. And a few weeks ago, the Libyans signed a peace agreement in Geneva to bring peace to their own country. So must we wait for more people to die in Cameroon before our international partners can come along? Why are they partners if they cannot speak up, even to their friends, if they cannot help us get together and find a way out of this crisis? So I call on those partners. I also call on the African Union to take its responsibilities, because our continental organizations are losing their credibility when they stand around and they see Africans killing other Africans and they don't say anything. So the regional bodies have to wake up and intervene and get their reputation back by intervening and creating an environment where we can now sit down as Cameroonians and talk to each other and resolve this crisis by going deeply to the root causes, so that we don't put a bandage over a situation and then in 10, 20 years, there's yet another war because future generations disagree with what we agreed upon at this point in time.
The United Nations Secretary General has been talking about the crisis. The latest statement from the U.S. came from the UN, came from the United Nations Human Rights spokesperson. President Macron of France has been talking about it, and other world leaders have been talking. What else can they do beyond talking, beyond statements? Yes. What else can they do?
Yes, I think that public diplomacy and the statements that they make are important. They're useful because they send a message to people on the ground that they are paying attention at higher levels. But I think we have, at this point in time, to go beyond just speeches and declarations. We have to look at targeted sanctions. There are people in countries such as Cote d'Ivoire and the Democratic Republic of Congo who were, when those countries were under crisis, targeted sanctions were meted out against individuals who were the perpetrators of violence and atrocities. It is about time we start talking seriously about targeted sanctions that will put some of these individuals on notice, that they will be held personally responsible for atrocities that are being committed in the Northwest and in the Southwest regions. That would be a first place to start. We can look at financial sanctions. We can look at visa restrictions. There are a whole host of tools and instruments that our partners can use to serve notice on the perpetrators of violence and atrocities. And I'm afraid that if we don't get to that today we are mourning Kumba, but in another month, some other bad thing is going to happen, and we'll rally around and we'll make declarations. And I hope that that doesn't happen, and that our friends could come to our aid, and people can wake up and realize that this is an existential threat for the country. And if we don't resolve this, we're going to live to regret for generations to come.
Dr. Christopher Fomunyoh, Senior Associate for African Regional Director at the National Democratic Institute for International Relations. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks, ladies and gentlemen, for staying with us. That's it for today.
Equinox Télévision, au-delà des